Mr. Hagmark, Happy New Year, and the floor is yours.
All right, Madam Mayor, Council members, Joshua Hagmark, Water Resources Manager, here today to talk about the status of the Desal project, and in particular, some recent changed conditions. Be going through the current status, project history. I think to understand some of the change orders that we are talking about, we need to understand a little bit about the project history. Then we're going to walk through those change orders and ultimately end on the recommendation for you today. So before we get into the details here, I just wanted to kind of familiarize everyone again with kind of the general layout of the site. We have our Desal plant here, which is located near the Highway 101 and off of Yananali. We have the chemical feed station, which is located on a corner of El Estero, the wastewater treatment plant. We have the marine work that's going on here. We have our beach weir box, which is kind of a pull box for pulling our wires, communication, electrical. And then we have our two intake facilities out here where the pumps and screens will be located. And then we also have the outfall, which is this orange line, which is our current outfall for El Estero, but also will be our brine outfall. So currently, the power distribution system center is in, and they're undergoing testing right now. The admin buildings, so these are existing buildings that we're basically reusing, and their main function is kind of, one's an admin, but the control center is really where the activity is going on right now to make sure that our controls operating, all the valves and pumps are all operating, and so they're going through testing on that. Then we have the media filters. There's 3 of them, and they've been loaded with media, and they're currently undergoing testing using potable water, circulating potable water through there just to test the valves and basically to start fine-tuning it. Then we have the post-treatment. This is where the minerals are added back in to the water. After you've gone through the RO membranes, the water is absence of any minerals, and there is a healthy balance to bringing minerals back into the water so that it's not corrosive to our water system. And so we'll be adding minerals back in, and this thing is undergoing testing right now, but there's not a lot we can do until we start bringing seawater on shore. And then we have our finished water distribution. This is the tanks, pumps, and then we'll be talking a little bit about the piping. We had anticipated being able to reuse the existing piping, and we're having to replace that, but that's currently awaiting water to test. We're moving on to the chemical feed station. Here's the line that comes in, the seawater line coming in from the ocean. You can see to orient you, this is the fire training center, fire training tower, in the back. The railroad tracks, and the picture is kind of taken from the Virchow building approximately. So here's our intake pipe coming in with seawater in it. This is the electrical station for the pumps, and it's currently undergoing testing. And then we have the chemical tanks. These are where pre-treatment chemicals are added. Right now we have one of these plumbed in, and they're still working to get the others plumbed in. As far as the marine work, the new lids and screens have been installed. The transition fittings, which we talked about during the last change order in August, the transition fittings have now been put in, and there was certainly a lot of work behind that, along with these couplings that actually tie all the piping out in the ocean together. And then basically the pump connections and check valves, we had to redo a lot of the assemblies that tie each one of those screens and pumps in. And then now what's remaining is pulling in the electrical cables and communication cables and testing those, and they're doing that this week. And we're hoping by the end of this week, early next week, they'll be setting at least one of the pumps. The other pump, we're going to talk about kind of its general timing because of some other unforeseen issues that had come up. Other work, Padre Pump Station. This work is a facility located near the Schott Center. It actually was an old groundwater well site that we've kind of repurposed and they're currently testing the electrical there, setting the pumps, and working on the distribution improvements there. This is critical to moving water out of the low zone into other parts of the city. And this has limitations, and that's why if we expand the facility, we need to talk about a different conveyance method, because there's limitations on how much water we can actually put through this. But for now, this will adequately distribute the current planned capacity of 3,000 acre-feet a year. The El Estero outfall mixing box, there's some work to
Mrs.
be
Maria
done.
has a
Mr.
question.
Hagmart,
Mhm.
so what would be the plan then for expansion? A different pump station somewhere else in the city footprint?
Madam Mayor, Councilman Maria, we are working on a plan that basically be a new transmission main that would take the water up and move it up further up in the system, and it would be pumped from the desal plant up. And so we're working conceptually on those ideas, and we'll be bringing that back for further discussion with council.
Thank you.
So then there's the outfall mixing box.
Excuse me, let me ask. What would be beneficial about doing that? Would be easier to distribute the water because it's higher up and you have more gravity flow?
There's several benefits to doing that. The main one is right now, in order to use the Padre pump station, we're kind of pushing water backwards through our distribution system, which is not necessarily ideal. If we put in this transmission main, the water would flow more how it's used to flowing now. We'd basically put it into our main lines, and then it would flow to reservoirs just like it's coming from Cater, basically.
How much farther up would that have to be? Do you
The piping would need to go from the desal plant on Yananali to Mission Street, somewhere in the Mission Garden
That's a
interchange.
long way.
It is a long ways. Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
The El Estero outfall mixing box, this is where all the brine is going to be mixed with our wastewater, and they're currently finishing up the sampling station that goes here. We needed to make sure that we can continue to get sampling from El Estero separate from the commingled water that's going out. We wanted this, our permit requires that we have separate metering or separate sampling. And then in general, electrical, we've gotten El Estero, the desal plant, and the chemical feed station all tied over. That was a big step because now we're able to meter individually the power that's going to be fed to each one of those sites so that we can properly control the cost of electrical and how much electricity is being used. And so that is in place. And that concludes kind of a general summary of where we are today. As far as status. Now, history. The plant, as you may recall, was constructed between October 1990 and February 1992. So roughly a 16-month period. The facility was built from scratch. And so as you can imagine, there was a lot of haste and urgency to getting going. And so when they were constructing this, they chose to pursue it with the design, build, operate, very similar to what we did. There was a lot of urgency to getting this up and operating. And when the contractor was done, they supplied the city with as-built drawings, sometimes referred to as record drawings of here's what happened. And that's a standard protocol typically with all of our projects. And so that was turned over to us and was the basis of kind of our direction to our current contractor. Unfortunately, what we found was that the record drawings or as-built drawings that we received did not actually reflect what occurred. I can get my head wrapped around why they cut the corners. I just can't get my head wrapped around why they didn't document it. And it's really kind of the frustrating part. I respect that they were in a hurry. And they used often in places concrete to kind of be a Band-Aid for properly mechanically connecting pipes. And so it's really kind of led to a lot of the change orders, and I don't want to, we'll be going into more detail about what each one of those change orders are, but that's been kind of the challenges that we're facing today.
Okay, but we have a question from Mr. Rouse and Mr. Dominguez.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So, Mr. Hagmer, since that time, have the engineering oversight protocols changed within the city when we have these kind of projects? Like, if you're having building a structure or certainly something as complex as this plant, are we more in the middle of how it goes on?
You know, the city has really prided itself on having good record drawing and as-built, so this seems like an anomaly to me. I feel like we've had in place, you know, under Pat Kelly and also under Brian Bossia, really a focus on, hey, we need to make sure that we document this so we understand when we go back in exactly what happened and how it was put together. And so to me, and in my experience so far, this seems like a deviation. And again, I think this was a very unique situation. The contractor was hired. I think if there's a little tweak this time around, we have someone on site who's overseeing what the contractor's doing, even though they are responsible for design and construction. There really isn't a construction management role as we would typically find in our routine projects that we do, but we have hired someone. We have an engineer out there who's actually making sure that what they said they were going to do, they're actually doing. And I don't know if that step was, they didn't do that back then. It's hard to piece together what happened back then, and there was a lot of urgency to it. All I do know is that for probably the sake of time, they did not do a lot of things that were said they were going to do on the drawings, and now we are kind of paying that price, and that's been kind of the frustration with this project all along. We thought the contaminated soils were, you know, we had some soils reports that says that the soil was fine, it was clean, and here we go digging in it and find trash and all kinds of other stuff. So clearly there were steps of documentation that did not occur, and it seems pretty consistent throughout some of the equipment and piping that we keep finding.
Well, I was thinking about going back to some of the anomalies in Lot 6 when we built that, and just as we go forward and start talking to people about financing some infrastructure improvements, changes, and maintenance, that getting the confidence in what we do, because I have confidence in our staff, but when things like that come up, you go, you know, gives you that pause.
Mr. Dominguez?
Kind of along the same lines, what would be different about the way we're doing it now? What were the lessons learned, and how did we apply those lessons?
Well, in our standard, I mean, we even give it a line item and a cost in the budget to actually track those drawings. We actually have a process of tracking the drawings during, you know, they have to be signed off by the inspectors, signed off by the construction manager. So there's a lot more formalities that we go through today, and then ultimately it has to be signed by the city engineer as a record of drawing before it goes into our vault for storage. And so that process has been in place since I started the city in 1999. So I don't know what happened particularly with this. And this, again, it's not a normal format for construction. We usually bid a project, do the construction management on it, and so we have a lot more tighter controls. This is kind of designed on the fly and constructed, and so it's a little different beast, but it still doesn't excuse why the record drawings did not reflect what actually happened out there.
The old one was designed on the fly,
On the fly.
not this one. You said this one.
Oh, sorry. No,
Just want to make that clear.
Yes.
Okay.
Was it the same type of design build contract?
It was a similar format, but I think we've managed this one a lot tighter. We know exactly what went in this time around, and we're going to have very good record drawings when we're done.
Is that vendor still in business? Are they still building Desal?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Did you say they're no longer in business?
That's correct.
Well, it strikes me, this is a dirty word, but if somebody says they did something and they didn't, and we paid a whole bunch of money for them not to do, or to do what they didn't do, that's fraud. Is that not fraud, City Attorney?
Not necessarily, Councilmember Hotchkiss. Fraud requires an intent to create a situation that somebody else is going to rely on to their detriment. So it might have been simple negligence. A staff member may have told them not to do it. So I can't say it's fraud at this point, 20 years later.
Do we have no recourse?
20 years later, I think it's unlikely that we have any recourse.
Well, I can tell you, if I found something was done at my house that was, and there was a misrepresentation, I sure as heck would go after him because I don't like to be lied to, and that's basically what happened here. Am I correct, Mr. Hagmark? To put a blunt face on it?
Yes, the question is, was it, I try to wrap my head around why they would
You've been
not,
enormously polite here, and I'm not being so.
Yes, I mean, I think it borders on the line of,
Yeah, I think so,
really
too.
kind of negligence of duty, but it may be at the time. I mean, I'm trying to create a situation where maybe there was no more money, because I know our partners were backing out, and typically record drawings are what is done at the end of the project, and it does take a lot of time to put together those record drawings, and maybe there was some discussion about, we don't want to pay you any more money, and the contractor's like, fine, here's the drawings for what we said we were going to do. And I don't know what happened.
Yeah, well, misrepresentations like that seem to me to be not only illegal, but fraudulent. Thank you.
Okay, it's 25 years ago, just
Yeah.
for clarification. Okay, and go ahead.
So I think, just kind of sum it up, these issues were not something that could have been reasonably known. I think that's important, or tested prior to award of contract. We did go in, we did do our due diligence with a lot of the facility, but there are many parts of the facility we couldn't tell. We couldn't tell. It wasn't reasonable for us to know this before we got in there. There was either specialized equipment needed, or there was no indication that this was going to be the problem. And so anyway, this kind of sets us up and takes us to the next part of our presentation, which is the pending change orders. And I have Ms. Szymanski here to walk you through those items.
Well, and just to clarify before you get there, this time around, I mean, a couple of things are changing this time around. One is our documentation is much different. You even said in the budget and the line item status are, so 10, 20, 30 years from now, whomever's sitting up here or where you are will be able to look at everything and see exactly what happened. That's the message I'm getting from you today. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And we need to do, and well, I guess in the other pieces, which is another policy question for us in the long run, is the plan for this plant is to be a regional, is to have a water supply component in some capacity in the long term in some way. And we have to go through those steps to make that happen. But if it's being used over time, even during non-drought years, or we still have, make those policy decisions, there'll still be a active, interactive component with staff or engineers at the plant on a regular basis, as opposed to mothballing it and closing it down and then not even looking at things until you have to do what we're doing, which is rebuild the plant. So, I mean, that's kind of as I understand it, that's kind of the movement forward of where we're heading after this is open.
Yeah, we'll be talking about how this facility may serve us in different ways going forward, both in our drought needs and in long-term water supply needs. But I believe the work of Ms. Szymanski and her team, we're going to have much more detailed record drawings. And then we also have asset management, which you guys have heard about before from the city, in which every piece, every component in this facility will have a maintenance record of when it was taken care of, how it was taken care of, when it was inspected. That is standard protocols now. We have that at our wastewater treatment plant and at Cater, and so that's part of the process that I'm going forward. So I feel that we're setting up the future council members and my predecessor to have a much different situation if they ever go in to do any major renovations or improvements here.
Yeah, because I think my colleague's point are well taken in the way Mr. Dominguez mentioned lessons learned and making sure we don't go down the same path again. So I'm glad to hear that we've taken those steps seriously. Okay. All right. You can go on.
Madam Mayor, council members, and Linda Szymanski, principal engineer in the engineering department. Mr. Hagmark's asked me to go over some of the pending change orders that we have and why we're here asking for more money for the project today. So I want to spend a little bit of time on marine work because this is where we have had most of our changes. So what you can see up here, what I have circled out on the end are the two pumps that bring the intake water into the plant. There's a connection piece that kind of is the Y piece between the circle and then the line that is the intake. We're actually replacing those two pieces. We hadn't originally planned to do that. They are actually the same material as a piece that we found onshore that we did replace. However, we couldn't get a chance to look at these until we got out into the ocean to do work. We actually got out there with our barge. We were able to actually bring them out of the ocean, clean them up a little bit, take a look at them, see what sort of shape they were in. What we found were some bolt holes that were of different sizes. We did find a little bit of cracking around the flange area, which is where these pieces connect together. So we did go ahead and decide that we needed to replace these two. One of the other things that we needed to do is work on the conduit for the offshore power and communications. A couple of things that have happened in this realm, we needed to remove the cable and pull in new cable. What we require electrically to run the pumps is different because our pump that we're using now is different than what we had in the original plant. It has a different capacity, requires a different type of wire. When we were trying to pull one of the wires out, we could not get it out. So the recourse for us on that was to actually pull the conduit out and put a new conduit in. Once we had replaced the transition piece out in the ocean, we realized that one of our conduits wasn't going to be long enough to actually connect. When we decided to go ahead and pull that one out and pull a new one in, we actually had to pull two of them out. They got tangled up together and we couldn't get them out. So we've actually replaced all three conduits that go from the beach out to the pumps in the ocean. So that has taken a little bit of time and effort for us to do. As we were getting ready to actually install the conduit it's near the bike path actually on the beach. We were going to connect to the transition piece that we had installed. We actually opened that transition piece and that pipe, and we had some water come out, which was very unusual. There really shouldn't be any way for water to get into the intake pipe. It should be a complete sealed pipe all the way over to our pump station area. We had to do a little searching. We believe that we found the culprit. There is a junction box where the intake pipeline makes a turn, and it's actually right up in this area as it makes a little turn and goes into the pump station area. That's actually an open vault with a grate over the top of it. And it was not something that we were scheduled to work on. We didn't believe that there was anything there we needed to do. But it turns out that there was an old valve there. It sat up fairly high in this box. And what we believe is between the tidal influence that actually comes into that box and some of the heavy rains that we had, we actually managed to bring the water level in that box up above this valve, and this valve was broken. It actually got, so we were actually bringing water into the intake pipe through that valve and filling it back up. So when we opened the pipe at the end on the beach, we had a whole lot of water come out. Not knowing exactly where that water came from, it took us a little while to find this. We actually stored the water on site until we could discover where it came from. We couldn't return that water to the El Estero wastewater plant because it is mostly seawater, and the El Estero plant can't handle the salts. So we actually had to haul that water away. So we're talking a number of thousands of gallons of water that we actually pumped out of there, held, and then had to haul away. So another expense that we hadn't been anticipating, but I do want to say that we've managed to repair that valve. We've had some significant rains since then, and we haven't had any problems. Lastly, out in our ocean work, we have some scour underneath the box that holds the pump intake B, which is actually the furthest pump out. Not necessarily all that unusual, but not something that we had seen when we initially started the project. When we were doing our original scoping of the work and putting together preliminary design, we did not have any scour out there. I think it's probably not unusual to see it. It probably has a lot to do with the time of the year and the way the tides move, that type of thing. It has exposed what are basically piers that are kind of holding that vault in place. What we really need to do is put something around there to help protect against any more scour. What we don't want to have happen is to have any shifting of that particular box and that pump. That pump needs to sit in a certain orientation to be able to work properly. So we're working right now on how we're going to actually kind of stabilize that area. We believe what we're probably going to do is build some forms around intake B, pour some pea gravel around there. That'll actually protect the sand moving around and actually exposing any of those piles a little bit more. So that's it pretty much for the marine work. A couple of other items that I wanted to bring to your attention. We are going to replace the product water line. Mr. Hagmark had earlier pointed out the area where the product water is actually stored before it goes to the distribution system. The dashed red line here is the old alignment for the pipe. And when we were pressure testing this pipe, we found that it would actually not hold pressure. We had actually managed to bring it up to testing pressure, and probably about 1 minute later, the pressure was at 0. There were actually no spots or any indication as to where the leak was along that line. To basically save time and basically so that we didn't have to chase a problem all the way along that pipeline, we've decided to replace the pipeline. There is an added benefit to actually replacing this, is we're going to move it out of its original alignment and put it along the edge of the plant. Therefore, if we do undergo an expansion of the plant, we're not going to have to work around it. So that will be another project that should be starting up in the next couple of weeks. I think Mr. Hagmark had mentioned to you that we are converting an old well site called the Padre well site up near the Schott Center and the hospital area from an old well to a pump station, again, to move the water out of the downtown area and into other parts of the distribution system. What we're working on here is bringing in electrical. When they abandoned the well site, they disconnected the electrical to it. So as we were actually digging to put in the new electrical line, we discovered some more contaminated soils. This was not expected in this area. So we actually had to do some testing, some characterization. It is a material that is very similar to what we have at the plant. So we have actually begun some of the excavation in this area. In addition to the electrical, we're also changing the size of the water pipeline that goes in and out of this pump station. When it was a well site, it was 8 inches. We're actually increasing the size to 16 inches so that we can move more water through this station. So we will be connecting basically the pumps which are behind the door in the building in the back, digging through the courtyard and digging out to the street to put in the new water lines. All of these areas need to be hauled away as contaminated soils. One of the other things that we're looking at, because we've added so much time with some of the unforeseen things that have gone on, we're looking at how can we bring the schedule back somewhat. What we've asked the contractor to do is look at things that are outside of what their typical sequence would be. What can we move forward? What could we do differently that would help us gain some time? Things that they contractually are not required to do. A couple of things that we've come up with. Most of it has to do with the media preparation. Typically what would happen is you would load the media for the first filter of the seawater, and then you would start processing seawater through it. You'd put your first layer of media in, you'd rinse it, and you'd put your next layer of media in, you'd rinse that, and you'd go through a sequence like that. And you usually do it with seawater because you're looking for certain conditioning with that with seawater. What we're doing is actually getting all of that media loaded and getting all of that rinsing done, getting all those fines out of there with potable water. This is actually going to reduce the time when we finally do bring the seawater in for the conditioning of the media. It's possible that we could go from what would be a 35-day period to a period that maybe is more like 20, 25 days. So we are going to be able to save some time by doing this now with potable water. The other thing that we're doing is testing some instruments and equipment, again with potable water. Many of these things will need to be retuned when we bring the seawater in, but we want to know that they are working, and we can do that with potable water. So these are items that weren't planned on, that is part of the responsibility for the city to pay for, but we believe that we're going to get a benefit from this by trying to shorten some of the lost time.
Is recycled water an option to use, or no, and why not?
Madam Mayor, no, recycled water is actually not. The Department of Drinking Water does not actually allow you to have.
Because it would be a direct potable.
It would be, it would be what they consider a cross connection. So
Okay.
they don't actually allow us to use
Okay.
recycled water.
Thank you.
Also, as part of the recommendation money for this project, we're looking at settling some claims that we have from the contractor. Basically, three components to this. One is extended overhead. I don't think there's any doubt that many of these unforeseen things that have come up have added time to the project. From a contractual standpoint, we are required to pay them for the extra time that they are here to do work. So we are working on the number of days that actually constitutes that extended overhead. One of the pieces of that is what we call concurrent delays. There are some things that the contractor does not have finished yet that are going on at the same time that the extra work that we are requiring is going on. One of the terms that we are working on for that is not to pay for those concurrent delays. The city really isn't responsible for that period of time when both are impacting the schedule. And then the last piece of that is that we do want to get water as soon as possible. And so there are some possibilities that we can bring water into the system before we actually accept the project. Acceptance means that they've gone through a period of time to show us that all the equipment works. If things go well and the equipment works and the Department of Drinking Water buys off, we can actually put water into the system during that acceptance period. We want to incentivize them to be able to put water into the system during that acceptance period. So we are looking at potentially giving them a little bit of an incentive to do that. That means that they have to be operating well for us to do that. They have to have the Department of Drinking Water on board. That could potentially buy us anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks of getting water into the system earlier than we had expected. So the grand reveal, I wanted to just kind of go over some of the pricing for the change orders. The marine work has been extensive. I think a number of the things that we've gone over with you. Wanted you to just keep in mind that all of the marine work that we do is very difficult. Many of the things that we need to do out in the beach area, we fight the tide every day. So, a good part of the morning may be spent pumping out the hole that we dug yesterday. And the times that we need to work out there change depending on what the tides happen to be doing. Also, having to have the barge out there to be able to set certain components, such as the pumps, such as some of these other pieces, is actually a fairly expensive endeavor. So we're trying to minimize that as much as possible, but the costs for the marine work do add up fairly quickly. And what we're anticipating is about $5.1 million to handle the things that I had gone over earlier. The product water line, we believe the cost of that to be about $650,000. It's not so much the water line itself, but the removing of the contaminated soils that's expensive for that. The additional contaminated soils at the Padre pump station, we're estimating at about 200,000. That includes having to recharacterize and put together a new plan for that. Because that site is away from the desal plant, we couldn't use what we had already done at the desal plant for that. The acceleration, these are for things like piping and valves that are allowing us to bring in the potable water to do some of the testing. We believe that's going to be somewhere about $125,000. And looking at the claims resolution that we're in the process of negotiating, we believe probably about $3.5 million based on the time of extended overhead that we have, which is roughly in the range of 130 to 150 days. So, all in all, the construction cost for this particular change order are just over $9.5 million. I just wanted to step through with you the total construction cost to date. It has been a challenging project. Our original contract with the change order was about $45 million. Our first time that we came back to see you for change order number 1, all related to contaminated soils, added about $2.3 million to the contract. The second time that we came back, a number of items, including the direct bury electrical that we had to solve, some things with the brine box that we needed to solve, also the transition fittings that we talked extensively about. That added just under $3.8 million to the contract. So the total prior to today was about $51 million. This change order adds about $10 million to the cost, for a total construction cost of just under $61 million. We also do have some other recommendations in there. We would like to extend the contract for Carollo Engineers. They are our owner's representative and been instrumental in helping to solve a lot of these unforeseen issues. Their time is going to be extended on site, that we believe that the $200,000 should cover their additional time. We're also asking for money for our cultural monitoring. With the addition of the product water line, one of the requirements that we have for the loan is that we have a cultural monitor on site for all the digging. We will need to extend his contract. We believe that $25,000 should be enough to cover the remaining trenching and excavation that we need to do for that. And then also staff time. Project administration time for myself and the many other folks who are participating in this project. We will need some more money for our time also, so that we're asking for about $150,000 for that. Schedule milestones. We are in commissioning right now. Most of that is with the potable water, so that continues to go on. We are making great strides there. We believe that once the pumps are set, we'll be able to bring seawater in from the ocean in late January. That will actually start the true conditioning process of our media filters. And then, depending on how the actual operating startup goes, we hope that we will have water into the distribution system sometime between mid-March and mid-April. And again, it has really a lot to do with how fast the media conditions itself, and it's kind of an unknown, and so that's why we have that fairly large time frame up there.
I mean, this is a very complicated facility. I don't think we have a facility as complex necessarily as this. So we do believe that there's adequate concerns for the startup and testing that's going to need to go on. There's a lot that's going on. They've already started that process, which is helpful, but that's one of the things that we have structured this, in particular this change order, to not only incentivize them to finish in that time period, but also make it very clear that liquidated damages set in if it's not. So that's kind of how this is being structured.
So I wanted to actually go over the total project costs for you. This started out as a $55 million project, and that's what we asked for our state loan. Just to kind of go over the various pieces of this, the preliminary design and permitting that we did for the project was about $3.4 million. The permit studies that we were required to do as part of our Coastal Commission permit, those are going to be about $2.2 million. That's actually going to be a little bit less than we had originally anticipated. The design build contract, the number that we just looked at, just under the $61 million, that started out with change order at about $45 million. And our construction management costs will be approximately $3.7 million. Those actually have gone up too with just the extended period of time that we've been out working on the project. So all told, our estimate is that this project is going to be just over $70 million. And Mr. Hagmark is going to talk a little bit about how we're going to fund that.
So, as Ms. Szymanski said, we are currently approved for a $55 million loan. We are started our work on the request to increase that loan. The state staff that we've talked to have all been no indication that that would be a problem. In fact, we have a council item coming up at the end of the month to get approval to move forward with that. In the meantime, water fund reserves are going to be used to kind of back this up. We anticipate it'll take about 6 months to get this SRF loan increase. It's just based on our experience that we saw with the secondary project at El Estero. And what we hope to do with this cost increase is not only address the current costs that we're seeing, but also to potentially increase the loan to address any potential expansion. And so we're scrambling right now to get all those numbers together. Our contractor that we're working with, IDE, has committed to giving us numbers for expansion, revised numbers for expansion by the end of this month. Probably take us some time to digest that, but we're trying to get together a number that we feel comfortable that at least we can start this loan process should we need that. At this point, I'm not trying to sell that we're going down that road, but I think given how long it takes to do the loan process, we can ask. Again, the loan will be based on what we actually end up borrowing. So the increase would be potentially for the city, but also if we were to reach an agreement with Montecito and need to expand the facility for them, so that it's kind of a dual purpose. So I think we're set up for the end of January, 1st of February to come back with the documentation and a formal direction from the council to move forward on that.
Mr. Dominguez has a question. Did you have a question?
The project cost is this construction management of 3.7. Where does this fit in? Is this something outside of the 43 million or the 60 million? And what is that exactly? Is that internal construction management?
So, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, that includes things like the owner representation contract that we have with Carollo. It includes staff time. It includes a lot of the work that we need to do with the county. It includes work that we do with SCE. It includes environmental work, kind of all the catch-all things that are not truly part of the construction. So that's what that
number
is.
Constant? Has that changed since the beginning of this project?
It has changed, and probably the largest change to that is the increase in time has increased our costs with Carollo and also increased the amount of staff time that we've been spending on this project.
So just to reconcile these slides, so the slide that says additional increases, it has the Carollo, the Tumamont, and the staff. Those aren't supposed to add up to the 3.7, or they do?
No, they don't. There are other things associated. They are part of the 3.7, but not the total of the 3.7.
So then the proposed change orders, so if it's 3.7 million, you're looking at about 375 in increases in that line item?
I think he's taken from this one right here. Sorry. He's taking these items here.
Yeah, correct.
In new change orders, not
new
including...
change orders, correct.
And the initial change orders were about close to 500,000. I'm just trying to get a sense of the scale of where the changes took place. And so why is Carollo's contract being changed so drastically?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, a portion of that has to do with giving us technical expertise on some of these changes and the directions that we need to go to solve some of these problems. Another portion of that is Carollo is providing the inspection on site. So they are fulfilling the role as the building department for us, and they are fulfilling the role as inspector for us. So when we increase the time of the project and the time that folks need to be out there, it does increase the cost fairly significantly.
So that concerns me. So maybe if you get into more detail, it'll deal with my concerns. But it seems like they're the ones watching out and solving the problems, but they're also the ones not catching the problems early enough. So it seems like there's a bit of a built-in conflict in their role.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, the design engineer on this is actually IDE. IDE, because this isn't our standard. We design it, they construct it. They're designing it and constructing it. But when they come across these unforeseen issues, they're kind of like, well, what do you want to do, city? And we are actively working side by side with them to resolve these problems. So it's not the typical format of a lot of our other projects. And so in this case, these problems aren't necessarily ones that they didn't oversee the design of this project. They provided us, they assisted us putting together the contract documents, kind of helping us to develop what we were looking for out of ultimately the design and construction, but Carollo did not design this project.
Well, and there's overlapping concerns I have, and so when you bring up unforeseen, I'm also concerned about the foreseeability of some of these problems that we've encountered. And it seems like most of the major systems that we have in the Desal plant have had major unforeseen errors. So at a certain point, is it fair to characterize our assumptions were that most of the systems would be working after 25 years until we find out otherwise? Because it seems like the opposite presumption now seems to be true, and hindsight's 2020. But that's kind of my overlapping concern with who's troubleshooting the problems as they occur, and why aren't they more aggressively troubleshooting those problems? If one system seems to have a lot of decay because of saltwater intrusion, shouldn't we have at some point realized, hey, 6 months from now it's going to be worse? And I know you've talked about getting the barge out there, and you can't just instantaneously examine pieces. There's a process and a timeline, so it makes it much more complicated than it would seem, but it does concern me. Can you pull a question out of what I just said as my concerns, or do you want me to?
Yeah, go for it.
So, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, I think the thing to keep in mind, at least on the marine piece of this, is we really weren't able to do a thorough inspection. There's 25 years of marine growth on a lot of these things that can't be cleaned off until you are actually ready to start your work, because it will grow back very quickly. Also, it's a part of the permitting where you need to actually go in and do a lot of mitigation and a lot of other things that need to get done prior to be able to doing the work. So there was not a way to know a lot of what was going on out in the marine area. I think some of the onshore things that we're looking at, for instance, the product water pipeline. When we design product water pipelines, we expect them to last 50 to 100 years. There really wasn't any reason for us to suspect that there was going to be a problem with this. If we had looked at a normal lifetime, we would have said it would have been fine. When we pressure tested it, it turned out not to be true. Again, something that I don't think we would have made a different assumption on. I don't know if that helps to answer your question.
It does a little bit, again, like it's the devil's in the details. And when you talk about I'd love to spend more time. I'm not sure if this is the appropriate venue to talk about who it is in particular making these assumptions. And in a normal management situation, you want to have someone, who's accountable and who stakes a claim and who you can rely on. And then if they're wrong, there's consequences. And if they're right, there's better consequences. But it worries me that we have a contractor who's, getting $600,000 extra change orders in this situation, particularly when I hear about the conduit. And I know it's got to be hard to pull a rubber hose through that pipe that much distance, but at the same time, I'm not sure how much of that was unforeseeable versus foreseeable, or just doing it wrong, because that shouldn't be that complicated. And
Yeah.
I guess the follow-up question is are we putting something like that out to bid?
So Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, a lot of these systems really we wouldn't know until we put them to test. I mean, we've had these systems offline. We really had to test them in order to actually verify their condition. And that got back to, Corolla went in when we originally started doing the pre-design. They tested some of the elements so that we could tell the contractor, here's the condition of some of these items. The rest of it we're going off of based of record drawings. Here's what it's done. We believe it should be. The pipe they used out for our intake pipe is HDPE. Again, should be good for 80 to 100 years. No reason why it shouldn't. And so some of these issues we've come across, I'm equally as frustrated by these costs, particularly given all the costs we are wrestling with in the drought. And this is incredibly frustrating. But at this point, I feel like we have a good direction on this. We are managing this the best we can and trying to control the costs as much as possible, but recognizing that we are not in a situation where we can just say time out and go and do a bunch of studies and come back and do this. I mean, it's one of those things where we needing to make decisions. We need to make decisions quickly because we want to keep this moving, because even stopping costs us money. That contractor, his overhead alone is it's $20,000 a day for his staffing and insurance and all that stuff. So if he's sitting there waiting for us to make a decision, it's costing us $20,000 a day. So we're trying to make these decisions and keep this project moving and keep this valuable and at this point, very critical water supply on schedule. And it's not easy, and I don't know that I would have any blame for Corolla. I don't know that there's anything they could have done, and again, they're now on site for substantially longer than they had expected to be there, and I think the costs that we have negotiated with them are reasonable. And again, I'm not excited about this. I've been wrestling with this, and obviously many meetings with the contractor over what is reasonable and fair in this, and trying to strike a balance.
And the $20,000 a day, that's the IDE.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's a more general level fundamental paradox that I'm grappling with is, I know we've talked about how fast we're actually getting this done, which is amazing, and we're all thankful given the drought situation that this is coming online. But then to hear how much we're actually paying now because we're late, it seems like we should have maybe made a bigger compromise in terms of our contract numbers, because if we knew it was going to be a miracle to pull this off, maybe we shouldn't have been quite as optimistic. How did you guys balance those tensions between wanting to get it done quick but knowing we're paying $50,000 a day if you add in all the costs or whatever it is above that?
Maybe I think we get back to answering this, but one of the things that I think might be helpful to put this all in context is what would it have cost us to build a new facility here? And we've talked about the permitting for this is probably 10 to 15 years if we wanted to do that now. But the intake structure and outfall, if we wanted to construct those or had to construct them this time, we're talking about a facility well over $100 million. And so as much as it pains me to have to spend this money, there is still immense value in the fact that this infrastructure was put in at some point. Wish it was documented better, but was put in. That could have helped us control the costs, because the contractor would have knew when he first took this job that he needed to get going on this work and make those repairs. But I don't, I feel like we have we've done our best job to negotiate with the contractor and come up with something that's fair and reasonable. He has good documentation to back up those costs that he has for his staff, and we can't argue with that. It's really just we're compensating him for actual costs that they're incurring for just being there. So I don't know that. Did that answer some of your questions?
It's definitely helping me understand this process. So in a specific situation like the conduit, did we put that out to bid, or that's just something where IDE says we've got to fix this for you and we're going to bill you after the fact?
Right, and the way we manage that, thanks to our like on-site folks and Linda here, is it's time and materials basically. So we're tracking every person on site, every piece of equipment on site, and we are compensating them that. Plus, they get a 15% profit. That's what they're entitled to on top of that. But it's very controlled, so it isn't just they come up with a wild number and we have to go with it. So there is some structure to it, and there's usually a time frame given to it. So, I mean, Ms. Szymanski can kind of elaborate on that if she wants.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, Mr. Hagmark's correct. Most of the work that we're doing, all the extra work, is actually being done on time and materials. So like you said, we are tracking the work that they're doing, and that's what we're paying for. We haven't done a lot of forward pricing. There were a couple of cases where we did look at forward pricing. We had something that had happened similar on a different project. We weren't happy with the way that pricing fell, so we went to a time and materials so that we're only paying for the things that we are getting.
So what are the controls? So you mentioned there's a way to control the time and materials. So they give you a bill or a statement, and you check up, hey, did we see 7 people out there working on this?
Yeah. Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, yes. I mean, it really is that detailed. We get a sheet from them every day that lists the folks who were out there. It lists the equipment that was out there. It lists the types of materials that they've bought. We do look at them every day. We sign off on them. So, I mean, we truly are watching those costs.
And to be the devil's advocate, how do we know someone else couldn't have done it in half the time? Because they clearly have no incentive, because not only are you paying them for time and materials for replacing the conduit, but if it takes longer, they're also, I think there's a clause in here regarding getting this done in time. If not, they're on the hook for a certain amount. I mean, there's all sorts of incentives in there for them not to work quickly. Yeah. Do we have industry standards we're holding them up against, or does Carollo produce a report that shows how other conduit laying processes, the timeline?
Yeah, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez. I think one of the things that we do look at is the amount of time that things are taking versus similar projects that we've done in the past. So we do keep a tight eye on that. We do have an inspector who actually watches all of this work. We actually have another engineer on site who is watching a lot of the work just to make sure that it is happening in a timely manner. One of the contractual arrangements that they have is that they need to work in our best interest. And we take that very seriously, and so do they.
And that's a city staffer who's the inspector and engineer? There's 2 separate city employees?
Yeah, these are actually Carollo employed people who are on site.
So again, that goes back to my other concern. They're not under any special incentive to make this happen faster. In fact, they're making more money. So really, both Carollo and IDE make more money the longer they take.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, the way these folks are going to make the most amount of money is to finish this job and move on to the next. So that's truly their incentive.
So explain a little more how that works.
But basically they're tied here doing work that they're making a certain amount of profit on. They could actually be out working on another project where they have built a larger profit margin into that project. They make money by moving on and doing projects. That's just the way a contractor makes money. So, I mean, their incentive really is to finish and move on.
There's a limit to how many projects they can work on at one time, or it's just more of a...
Typically, when they put together a proposal, they have profit they build into that, and as long as it falls within that work, they make that profit. So when these projects start dragging on like this, their ability to make that profit and move on to the next project and have a substantial profit kind of diminishes. And so they're incentivized to get in, get the work done, and move on to the next one, where they can make that profit that they kind of build into it. This one is, as longer it drags on, they're just covering their costs.
I might have a slightly more cynical worldview, but let's hope that you're correct.
Mr. Hart?
Well, looking forward rather than backward, you're asking IDE to come up with some additional costs for additional increments of capacity from the plant. And you're, I assume, doing a number of different iterations of that. And given the complexities of what's gone on so far, are they likely to put in a lot of cushion into those estimates, or are we essentially giving them a clean site that is easier for them to incrementally estimate the additional costs going forward? You know, this has been much more complicated than was originally thought, and you know, we want to look at this next increment and understand what the range of change is potential going forward.
So, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hart, I do believe strongly that we have addressed the major unknowns. And in that, you know, we've sized this intake facility for up to 10,000 acre feet, the pumps, electrical system. So we have the control system. All of these unknowns that we've come across have been basically, we've uncovered what when we talk about expansion, we're talking about adding additional treatment trains. To that extent, we know that when we do, we're going to have to deal with contaminated soils, but we now kind of quantified how much is there. We know what we're getting ourselves into this round, so I think it'll be a lot better easier to control the costs associated with that, in particular the time schedule, which I think is going to be critical when we're talking about expansion. It needs to happen in 12 months. We need to know that's going to happen. So that's, I feel more confident about this next round, and I don't expect the contractor's going to be throwing wild numbers at us. We have already, as part of their original bid, they had to give us a cost estimate for expansion to 7,500. So we have kind of a benchmark of roughly where these numbers should be coming in at.
And in your conversations with IDE, do they kind of do they characterize it the same way, that the experience going to this date was unpredictable versus going forward is more predictable?
Yeah, and it's interesting to see how the relationship's up. IDE was the designer and they're the operator. So this construction part isn't where they make their money, and so they're eager, you know, they're frustrated by a lot of these change orders too, because it's delaying them getting into operating mode, which is where IDE expertise is. And so they have a lot of incentive to get through this process. And in fact, when the seawater starts being pumped on shore is when it's hammer time for them, in the sense that that's when they start really mobilizing on site and doing their business.
All right, thank you.
So, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hart, the other thing to keep in mind is that there will not be any more marine work. Most of the work that we're going to be doing in an expansion phase would be at the plant itself. So,
thank you.
Mr. Hotchkiss, and then we're going to go to public comment.
When we get these change orders or requests or whatever I'm going to call them in, do we ever take them to one of their competitors and say, is this reasonable?
Let's see. On a typical project, if we find that a proposal is outrageous, we will either ask them to do it on time and material, or we will remove it from the scope of work and potentially bid it out separately. This project kind of has challenges with that, because to take that project, to take an element out of their scope of work, bid it out and have it done separately would take far longer. I mean, the bidding process is at least 3 months for us to go through a bidding process of selection. And I do not believe that we would come up with a number that's superior to what we've been getting.
Yeah, I'm not talking about a bidding process. I've been on the other side of these negotiations, and every now and then you find out that something that's good on paper has got a whole bunch of cushion and padding in it. And, this is not your area of expertise. So would it not make sense to go to a competitor and say, look, does this seem reasonable? Just consult here. Because I think we need more eyes on this. This is a $15 million oops we got. That's a lot of money. We shouldn't have it. Go ahead.
So, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Hotchkiss, let me give you a for instance on this one. When we came across the direct burial of the electrical cable that goes from the Desal plant back to the pump station area, and we had expected it to be in conduit, and we actually had to put a new electrical line in. We had done a similar type of work with Lash at the El Estero wastewater treatment plant. So we were actually able to look at the costs that were proposed by IDE and compare them to what we had done on the Lash project and found them actually to be fairly reasonable. So there are many instances where we're able to take things that we've done on other projects and use those as a comparison.
Well, I just like this contractor to feel like somebody's looking over his shoulder and sharpens his pencil. Right now, I think we're dealing with crayons is what it feels like.
Okay, we're going to go to public comment. We have two speakers, Phil Walker and then James Finkner. Come on up.
Good afternoon again, Madam Mayor, members of the City Council. Thinking back, I was started in December 1981. I was well versed at El Estero during the time the original Desal plant was built, and I think Cushman Engineering Contractor was spot on. I'm not going to the owner at the time that sold it to the city of Santa Barbara, Ionics, but I still have some questions how the membranes were dealt with. They were sold for 10 cents on the dollar apparently, but they would not last that long. They didn't have a good storage life. But stuff happens in major projects. I worked through a number, and I remember the 30-inch HDPE brine line was trenched, but it was not secured and bedded in. We had an 8-inch fire line built, blowout, and it filled that whole trench and floated that line back out, and it had to be repositioned, took some time and money, and that's how things are in real life. But even if this project goes up, hopefully on a regional basis, has regional involvement to $100 million, I still think it's an excellent insurance policy. Everybody needs to remember, at 1990 late, I walked Lake Kachuma right out to the intake, and we were in serious trouble. Fortunately, we got the March Miracle 91 rains, but the Coastal Branch Aqueduct was first started in 1992 and didn't go online till 1994, and at that point we were really up against the gun time-wise. So things happen in construction, major construction projects, and I think the city staff is doing an excellent job in dealing with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Fickner. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity to address this issue. If you look at these change orders, they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's going to be ratepayers that are paying this. This proposal raises a number of red flags, serious ones, and some questions. First, if I can just ask you to go back to that slide of the numbers, I think it was 18. There we go. None of those numbers are audited. None of those numbers are based on a competitive bid. Okay? Time and materials is not a competitive bid. All right? Now, I could talk for half an hour on these numbers, but I don't have that much time. I'm just going to talk about the biggest one, this $5.1 million for conduit. Okay? Total, if you work it down per foot, $1,000 a foot for this conduit. All right? If you look at horizontal drillers, they charge about $20 a foot in this county. So I don't know much about this, but I do know how to use a telephone. So I called this morning a horizontal driller in Ventura, and I asked, I said, is $5.1 million, is that reasonable? He wants to bid on this project. I'm sure that in the North County we can find a lot of others that want to bid on this project. I think it's hard for me to understand why we're outsourcing this thing to people who don't work here and are overcharging by millions of dollars, which really brings me to my last question. Does our city administration have a fiduciary duty to the people of this city? And if they don't, why not? Well, thanks for your consideration.
Okay, that concludes public comment. It's to the council. Now we're all digesting all of this. On that happy note, question was raised about rates and what will happen or could happen. I know you mentioned hopefully we'll have a loan expansion. Obviously, you've got to pay back the loan. There's reserves. What do you expect, if anything, at this point, or if you've done the analysis yet of what this could do to water rates, either next July, or do we need to look at water rates between now and July again, or what? If you can comment on that.
So I don't have a feeling about the rate increases because we're dealing with a lot of very different issues. But we are certainly working on revamping our rates now, going through another round of looking at all of our costs. And we'll be likely back to council in March to start that discussion about what it's going to look like, what the rate's going to look like, and how we're going to adjust going forward.
Okay. Ms. Murillo, and then Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I was ready to make a motion, if I may. And we knew when we went down this path that it was an old facility and there would be a lot of challenges, and we have no choice as far as I'm concerned. It's raining today, but we know that's a drop in the bucket. And the climate change models say that droughts are longer, and when it rains longer. So we're dealing with reality. So I would move the recommendation A through E, Madam Mayor.
Is there a second? Second by Hart. Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I do believe, I think that there have been some hindsight comments made today, not only by staff, but by the public and even by my colleagues here, that I think have some merit. I think that there's, again, in hindsight, could we have looked at a 25-year-old facility that was putting electricity and various materials under salt water for a quarter century, that we might have done more. At the same time, as Ms. Murillo said, this is an essential facility. This is an existential project for us, and so we must go forward. And to do second guessing at this point, I think that there are opportunities to do better on this project, and certainly on any other going forward, then hopefully, as Mr. Dominguez said, what lessons are learned. Let's hopefully learn some of those. I have been very distraught by each of these sets of change orders and the cost to go up. Your mayor's comments about rates is certainly one that I know that our staff is very concerned about, and has been as this the scale of this has loomed. But we get back to, this is an essential project and we must move forward. So let's move forward. I think I'm also grateful that we have an opportunity to expand this state loan, which that's unusual. And that's going to help us stay out of punitive territory here, where we would be raiding all of our emergency reserves. I mean, there's some scenarios that we could look at that would be even worse. We still have the resiliency, financial resiliency in our system to be able to take these late hits. And I think that's a credit to the system's, the city's traditional financial system. And it's being challenged now, and it's holding up under this really substantial insult. So I'm looking forward to this project going forward forthwith.
Mr. Dominguez?
I would be more likely to support this if we could bring it back with more detail, or if we could insert some assurances now, even if it was to bring on someone even for the remainder of the contract to take Carollo's place on a capped contract basis, rather than having this incentive that encourages them, or at least doesn't encourage them, to make sure things move along speedily.
Okay. Well, I know it wasn't great news when you got all this information. I know you're doing what you can with the information you have, and I think there has been some hindsight issues and maybe bigger buffer we could have put in the original loan. Frankly, to go out searching for another contractor at this point is going to take up precious time, and we may just get back to where we are today, except time has gone by. And I do expect, and you've heard from all of us, that, you know, we expect and we know that you're going to be following this in a very detailed manner, and make sure that every dollar that's being spent is spent to keep this process moving, and to make sure that we open up a facility that's going to work for a very long time, and in a way that's going to address our very important needs. Even though it's been raining for the week, we're still below average in this part of the state. It's flooding in other parts of the state, but we're not even close to an average year even today yet, in this rain year here. So it's the part of a bigger picture. Not a happy picture at this moment, but we hope soon that we can have a facility that will meet the needs that are necessary for us in order for health and safety for our water supply. So I'll be supporting the motion. So we have a motion and we have a second. We know what it is. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? No. Okay, that's 6-1 with Dominguez saying no. Opposed. Okay, so thank you very much.